Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book review. Today, I will be talking about this book, Beyond Beef. This is one of those books that I read and read not because I was particularly interested in the message itself, but because I thought that what I could learn from it was valuable enough. And it was informative, but it didn't inspire change in me. That may just be because I'm stubborn or because I like beef that much, but about this book, April 30th, 2019, I have a receipt in here, and that would indicate to me that I had it my second summer. In my second summer, I had so many used books in my backlog, I ended up becoming known as like a library in a way to the other staff. If they wanted to look through the kind of books I was reading, they could borrow it and read it. One of my coworkers, a guy from India, he actually used that library of mine to read Snow Leopard, which I may get around to sometime on this channel. I've mentioned it in another video before. The subtitle is The Rise and Fall of the Cattle Culture. It was published in 1992, and I don't see any information on here about this being a later printing. It looks like it was first printing March 1993. It is an interesting book. Let's see, some of the praise for it from Washington Post: fresh thinking and well-reasoned arguments combining reliable research with logical conclusions, Rifkin offers enough economic, medical, environmental, and ethical arguments to persuade any open-minded person to pass by the meat counter. San Francisco Chronicle has just a very abbreviated statement: fascinating, impeccably researched. This is an activist style book. It's 290 pages, and the copy I have has a lot of notes in it, underlining a little, stuff in the margins, comments by the person who read this previously, who owned it previously. I'll try and look for one if there's any actual notes. This part on page 143, I have it states, studies have shown higher incidences of human leukemia in countries with a high percentage of cattle infected with BLV. Similar studies in Sweden and the Soviet Union have linked BLV outbreaks and increases in human leukemia. There's a note here that mentions teeth health. Almost everything here is in pencil. Only a bit of it is in red ink. Someone else thought it was important enough to underline it or to bracket it. Maybe they were using this for an essay, and they were pointing out evidence that they could use for it. And yeah, that makes my experience different than most other people's. The contents of the book cover the entirety of human interaction with cattle from chapter 1, where it's describing several millennia before the birth of Christ, a powerful king emerged among the peoples of the Nile River. Narmer Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom, creating the first great empire in Western history. Although he is remembered by historians for his extraordinary military accomplishments, Narmer Menes' spiritual achievements were no less significant. The new king introduced bull worship throughout his kingdom, creating the first universal legend. According to legend, the bull god Apis was conceived by a special cow who had been impregnated by a ray of moonlight. The young bull god was elevated to the spiritual throne of the new Egyptian empire, and from this vaunted position he ruled over the heavens and the affairs of society. Looks like everything through chapter 6 was a compilation of human history and their interactions with cattle. And from there, Chapter 7, Catalyzing the Americas, 8, British Beef Eaters, all the way up through Chapter 10. And the book focuses on the English and American use of cattle and how it has fueled international policy. And it goes on. There's a lot of really interesting bits. There's one part I really liked. I liked it not necessarily because of the relevance to the rest of the book, but it is still in its own way relevant. As long as the cattle barons could afford to maintain small armies of hired guns to protect their sphere of influence, little could be done to thwart their control over the grasslands. Then, in the 1880s, a revolutionary new invention made its way west to the plains, changing forever the dynamics of power on America's rangeland. Barbed wire facilitated the enclosure of public lands in the United States. Josephine Glidden had devised this new kind of fencing a decade earlier. He had apparently come up with the idea after his wife implored him to put a fence around her garden to protect it from neighborhood dogs. Glidden borrowed his wife's coffee grinder to use it as a reel for the smooth wire, and with the aid of an old grindstone to bend it, he placed short pieces of wire with sharp points around the smooth wire. He was granted a patent on his invention on November 24th, 1874, and opened up a small manufacturing plant in DeKalb, Illinois. It seems like a small aside, unimportant in a way, how barbed wire was invented, but it serves as a light-hearted anecdote that leads into the rest of the chapter. This chapter is barbed wire and land scams, and what it does is it seeks to explain why or how cattle ranching became big business in the West. Previously, it had been big business, but you needed, as they said, public lands that weren't cut off by fences. But with barbed wire, you could section off land and make sure you had deeds to watering holes, such that when smaller farmers didn't have those watering holes, didn't have access to those watering holes, they would have to sell off their land that would be gobbled up by bigger businesses. And it's this feedback loop that leads to the industrialization of beef, which is part 3. The idea put forth in this book is that beef is the highest of meats, so to speak. Chicken, pork, fish, these are things that are cheaper to get. Beef is expensive, and big economies want beef. Big populations want beef because they feel wealthier with beef on their table. It describes every part of it, from the history of the world's interaction with beef, to the history of England's interaction with beef, to the history of America's interaction with cattle, all the way to all the health effects and all the long-term effects on our world that cattle cause desertification, land degradation. They destroy native grasses to the point where only imported grasses can thrive, and imported grasses that are used to feed cattle. It goes into how the Amazon is being deforested, and this is, mind you, 30 years ago when it was published, 1992, all the way to 2022. The Amazon was being deforested back then, and it still is, and it's being deforested because of cattle companies on land that doesn't really sustain cattle for more than a couple years. It's terrifying in a way, and it closes up with a section a couple chapters before the end: cattle and the frontier mentality, the hamburger and the highway culture, the destruction of modern meat beyond beef is the final chapter, which, is the name of the book. This book is informative, it is persuasive, it is reflective. When I read this, I wasn't going to stop eating beef, and I still like eating steak and, burgers, that kind of thing. But it helps me contextualize and think about all the moving parts that went into that cow getting to my table, and all the ways in which cattle should be an occasional, a sometimes food, and not a constant food for Americans. The author of this book doesn't seem broken by the end of the book. They seem hopeful that we can change. As a world, we can change. And that maybe we'll be more cognizant of our cattle consumption. Probably won't happen. There's a lot of lesser developed countries, a lot of developing countries in this world that want a piece of the pie that Europe and the Americas, North America, has. I bought this book used. $6. This was only a portion, probably got 3 books at Coas that day. I bought it used. I've read it a couple times, twice just in the summer of 2019 and a couple times since then. It is educational, a well-written story of cattle culture. And I think if you see it used, definitely buy it. And if you see it new, well, I'd still say buy it. I would definitely buy it used and look for it used first. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book review. I hope to see you next time.